Kaiser Siegfried ascended to the throne at the age of 33, a much kinder man than his father because of how close he was to that evil. He ascended to the throne with fabulous personal wealth, with which the people hoped he would restore what his father gutted. The first thing he did as Kaiser was welcome back the Jews into the Volksreich, though many of the common people had adopted a rather hostile attitude towards them during their absence. The capital, however, would remain at Stettin, and many of his father's reforms would stand unchallenged. The beginning of his reign was disastrous. The amateurish standing army and the depleted levies provided by disgruntled nobles couldn't fend off the frenzy of attacks in the British Isles and Italy, and so much of the work that was done in sweeping up failed kingdoms was undone almost completely in the course of a year. Specifically, Deheubarth and Wessex signed the Treaty of the Isles, the first of its kind in that land, to drive out the foreign lords. This included the Volksreich, and in their moment of weakness their lands were overcome. Most fighting men there had died, but many of them had dispersed themselves into the civilian population they now found themselves a part of. As such, the peoples of Wessex and Deheubarth went from firmly Anglo-Saxon and Celtic respectively to notably more Germanic in character and demographic makeup. Certain loanwords made it into the Isles, as well as physical characteristics like blonde hair and taller stature. In comparison to Italy, it was quite a peaceful exchange of power. The Italian peninsula was steeped in blood during this time. That long, snaking corridor which terminated in Rome was rushing shut like the Red Sea closed up on the Egyptians. Ifriqiya, Spoleto, and the Magyar-Ország had no formal treaty, but informally agreed to avoid confrontation between each other until they had split up the peninsula amongst themselves. Ifriqiya surged up the Adriatic coast, while the Magyar-Ország and Spoleto became masters of the Tyrrhenian Sea. In 1360, the Magyar-Ország came to the walls of Rome itself, armed professionally with onagers, trebuchets, and siege towers. They brought an army of incredible power to drive out the Volkish people, which numbered at 60,000 men. The siege was going well, so long as the Volkish roads to the north remained open. Of course, they did not hold, with Spoleto cutting across in the north, isolating the Eternal City. With the Magyars blockading the city with its many ships, pounding it with their siege engines, and gnawing at their every defense with a relentless ocean of fighting men, Volkish Rome fell to the Magyar-Ország Empire. They filled every crevice of the city, and conducted all manner of evils in every fashion imaginable, just as the Volkish men did when they took the city, a triumphant army of young empire. Rome had not been in Catholic hands since Saint Sarah the Cruel conquered it from Milano 282 years ago. Meanwhile, even the Albigensian Patriarchate, under Patriarch Drosuk II, found purchase to take what they wanted. In 1361, the Treaty of the Isles broke down, and thus the struggle between Wessex and Deheubarth would define the region for a long time to come. In June of that year, Kaiser Siegfried contracted consumption. His court physician was the witch his father hired, and as treatment she removed his right eye. Meanwhile, even given the circumstances, the church was defeated yet again. In March of that year, the ravaging of the city and its people finally over, the Magyar-Ország, in a grand ceremony, gave Rome back to the papacy under Pope Innocentus VI. The rebuilding of St. Peter's began at once, a variety of improvements planned for the glorification of God. By 1362, stability returned as Volkish troops were able to defend certain key areas, and Kaiser Siegfried's levies returned to him. After the recent chaos, he proved that he was no spendthrift. Using the new systems put in place by the imperial administration, Kaiser Siegfried was able to get the Volksreich the highest monthly tax income the realm had yet seen. This was bolstered by building projects and guild investment across the empire, setting it on the path to becoming wealthy beyond imagining. In 1362, the Fatimids declared a jihad upon the unlikely kingdom of Bulgar, an Albigensian kingdom that existed because of a jihad in the first place, having been remade after a crusade. Immediately in 1363, the emboldened Pope Innocentus VI declared war upon the Ashrafids, hoping to carve out a Catholic kingdom in southern Greece and Egypt. In 1365, a stone quarry near Schwarzburg that was built in 1290 by Saint Erhard the Holy was shut down because it no longer produced quality stone. The people living near the quarry began to pray at it. On the 20th of January, since Siegfried did not see war as a profitable endeavor, pledged a 5-year peace in order to see the realm prosper. In 1365, the jihad for Bulgar was a success, cutting off the Albigensian bridge and reconverting the Bulgars to Islam. In December, Tanis Walram was forcibly abducted by rivals of the crown. Kaiser Siegfried was devastated and searched frantically for him. In 1366, the mastermind of his son's captors, Queen Beatrix of Denmark under the Volksreich, declared a revolt league to lower the crown authority with an army of 45,000 troops. With Siegfried and his immense wealth, however, he was able to buy as many soldiers as he needed, something the Danish queen did not quite understand. Her forces scrambled, used to kaisers who relied on their vassals for almost their entire army. But when an outrageously wealthy Kaiser can just go over their heads and buy the largest army in Europe, what use is there in rebelling? In 1367, the Papal War against the Ashrafids failed. In 1368, the Queen of Denmark and her revolt league to lower the crown authority was soundly put down. Regardless, when his son was recovered from Beatrix, Tanis Walram died on the 8th of August 1370 at the age of 20 due to the level of abuse he suffered in her dungeon, leaving his sister Volsana as heir and only surviving child of Kaiser Siegfried. Unlike his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather before him, Kaiser Siegfried actually loved his children, and so he was struck with a grief nearly impossible to bear. He sank into a depression from which he would not recover. In 1379, word of another plague, once again originating in the Fatimid Empire, reached the ears of the mourning Kaiser. On the 17th of July, 1383, after an exceptionally peaceful and prosperous rule, Kaiser Siegfried died at the age of 60 due to severe stress. His honor beyond refute, he surely reached heaven and was reunited with his son. Kaiserine Volsana ascended to the throne at the age of 36, with her father's immense fortune to care for. Time would tell if she would prove a good steward. Unfortunately, due in part to mercury pills she was taking to unnaturally extend her life, Volsana was a lunatic, even if she was a quiet and polite one. She was heavily informed on all of her decisions by her regent, Lord Guntram von Kaleroy, an expatriate noble from Aquitania, made to flee that empire by way of his Albigensian faith. Almost immediately after her coronation, a revolt league was declared to attempt independence from the Volksreich, which was almost immediately crushed by over 53,000 hired men. The dissatisfied nobility tested their hand, only to find that Lord Guntram was an adept advisor to the crown. In 1389, the Rus declared war upon the Volksreich, confident in their chances against an unsound woman. On the 21st of December, 1389, Kaiserine Volsana died in battle at the age of 42. That is to say, she insisted on surveying the fighting herself from a hill and was killed by a stray arrow. Luckily, she had a 16-year-old bastard whom she legitimized, but regardless made her own well-kept secret, resulting in Kaiser Norbert's ascension to the throne. The boy's father, an Albigensian priest, was defrocked but made a courtier by his son, as he was now the Kaiser. Blessed with great knowledge, his rule was bound to be impressive. Kaiser Norbert lost the war against the Rus almost immediately, but he held that the lost stretch of land was useless and it needed to go anyway, comparing it to pruning a great tree. His courtiers were not amused. His first endeavor with the crown upon his head was to commission a map of Europe in 1390, filling it with his own details and footnotes even the most dedicated of scholars would overlook. Beginning in the west, the British Isles were finally coming into their own, dominated by Deheubarth and Wessex, though the French kingdom of Arcello had almost entirely relocated to Ireland. Iberia was defined by the ongoing reconquête, Aquitania alone driving out the broken and panicked Yusufids, Hayyun, and Andalusians. The Gallic region was firmly split between Aquitania and Vexin, with the remnants of Rossello holding on to parts of the Pyrenees. The center of Europe was held by the Volksreich, which, while shrinking, still actively held land stretching from the Low Country to the Black Sea, and from Scandinavia to the Alps. a power which was a seemingly setting sun, but in the sky nonetheless. The far north was still disunited, Iceland and Suomi challenging the Volksreich for control of the fjords. Eastern Europe was more consolidated than it had ever yet been, dominated by the Rus, who held off the challengers of Bulgar, Holy Kiev, Suomi, and the nomadic Aksu in the Far East. The Italian peninsula was home to a medley of powerful empires, and it was not yet clear to who the victor's spoils would go. The Middle East was quite disunited, the Mongol Khorasan collapsing into a handful of constituent states and successor sultanates, of which Aksu was the most powerful. The Fatimids were recovering from their centuries-long run-in with the Horse Lords, taking land west of the Punjab and supporting their ally Lakandu against the Magyar Ország in the west. The Ashrafids were in control of Egypt, making inroads into Greece, with a tributary in Arabia. Finally, Africa was not its own. Ifriqiya laid claim to a sprawling Saharan empire, reaching deep into the desert and laying claim to the Bedouin trade routes that had run through the sands for centuries. Their presence here cut off any route of escape for Muslims trying to survive Aquitania's reconquête. Lakandu held a middling stretch of land directly to the east, which Ifriqiya saw fit to conquer one day soon. The religions of the world were now well defined, without much overlap. Catholic Europe was fairly devoid of heresies, and they were even mounting the largest conversion effort in history through Ifriqiya, converting much of Africa. The Albigensian faith was not looking to the future in and of itself, largely confined to the Volksreich and Holy Kiev. It saw no growth, and in fact was shrinking as the Volksreich lost territory. The Orthodox tradition was present in a single province in southern Greece, destined for extinction, and the Manichaeans competed with their fellow Gnostics, the Mandeans, in the far eastern steppe. Sunni Islam was doing well for itself, making inroads into Greece and firmly holding Anatolia, but the future did not look good for many of the realms which were responsible for the spread of Islam itself. Finally, the governments of the known world were very authoritarian. Most of Europe was strictly imperial, and even the aristocracy chafed beneath this heavy yoke. The Rus, however, were feudal, as well as Vexin and much of the British Isles. The Muslims perpetuated their Iqta system as they always had, though this was threatened in the same way the religion it was derived from was threatened. Finally, there were scattered nomads in the mountains, these being the final holdings of the Mongol Khorasani. On the 7th of July, 1393, Emperor Gael the Great of Aquitania declared war upon the Volksreich. Due to the astoundingly low morale of his armies and the incompetence of his corrupt generals, Kaiser Norbert lost that war as well by 1394. By 1400, Kaiser Norbert's uneventful rule had brought about a white peace with the revolt faction and minor gains in Italy at the cost of a slowly dwindling treasury, down 10,000 ducats from the time of his coronation, a scant 11 years ago. On the 20th of June, Pope Clemens VI declared the crusade for Lakandu, the empire of Muslim Greeks who dominated Anatolia, and sparred with the Magyars on a regular basis. In July, Kaiser Norbert earned the title of the Bear for his ever-increasing heft and heavy beard to hide his growing chins. Kaiser Norbert had recently married a woman named Digdegu from Wales, and had 2 children with her, his oldest son, also named Norbert, and his second son, named Burkhard. A daughter was also later born to them, named Clotilda. By 1405, the crusade for Lakandu failed, highlighting that even if the Pope held Rome, perhaps he was not yet ready to enforce the will of God with the blade just yet. In 1411, another daughter was born to the Kaiser, named Liutgard. By 1414, the treasury had recovered and prospered, reaching a fortune exceeding even his great-grandfather's, more than the Volksreich had ever held at any one time. In 1415, the kingdom of Vexin, Aquitania's northern rival, entered union with several smaller kingdoms and became the United Kingdom of Alençon. Meanwhile, to the south, the Sicilian Empire of Ifriqiya had colonized North Africa and penetrated deep into the Sahara, establishing themselves as a major European power. In 1417, Roy Herbert the Gentle of Alençon declared war upon the Volksreich. Despite hiring over 44,000 men, the sheer corruption amongst the military commanders in this new imperial system led to the fact that the Volkish army, fat and rich, could no longer fight a proper war. Alençon took their victory in 1418. In 1424, Kaiser Norbert the Bear lost yet more territory to Alençon. In 1429, he lost territory to the Rus. In 1431, he lost land to Aquitania. On the 2nd of June, 1439, Kaiser Norbert the Bear died at the age of 66. By the time of his death, the amount of territory he lost was simply embarrassing. He was, however, one of the longest-lived and wealthiest Kaisers to date, leaving his successor an impossibly large fortune. So, while not the best ruler, he certainly was far from the worst, despite appearances. Kaiser Burkhard, known as Brother Burkhard for his unusual zealotry, ascended to the throne at the age of 40. He proved full of anger, earning the title Son of Satan by December, though he did regain much of his father's lost territory, namely through his wars with Tsar Cosmo Blatomil of the Rus. He also was able to largely fix the army's corruption problem by 1442 by having disloyal or lazy commanders killed. These actions led to the swelling of the ranks to 115,000 men, the largest in Europe. Of course, this was all done on the back of his father's fortune, which dwindled 20,000 ducats by 1443, barely 5 years into his rule. Meanwhile, to the east, Holy Kiev declared itself an empire, as well as the only true Kiev, since the other one had become the Rus. As the new year of 1444 dawned, the 44-year-old Kaiser Burkhard tossed about in his sleep, the jeers of peasants and outcasts alike pulling at the hem of his robes, shouting at him, tearing his flesh from his bone, and throwing rocks at him in volleys of the hundreds. As he sunk into the filthy masses, he awoke with a start. Simply a bad dream. Staring out his window into the deep blue of Stettin, he wondered what that poor peasant king Amadeus would think of what his people's kingdom became. Perhaps some reforms were in order.